Marcus Wellington stepped out of his gleaming glass office building on a chilly October morning in downtown Chicago. The 45-year-old billionaire was known for his morning walks, a habit he maintained despite his massive success in the tech industry. Today, however, something would change his life forever. Wearing his usual casual attire, a simple black sweater and jeans that masked his wealth, Marcus walked past the same streets he traveled for years. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as busy professionals rushed to their offices, coffee cups in hand. Marcus preferred these quiet moments before his day of endless meetings and decision-making began. As he turned the corner near Jefferson Park, something caught his eye, or rather, someone. A homeless man was sleeping on a wooden bench, his belongings stuffed into two worn-out backpacks beside him. What made Marcus stop in his tracks wasn't the usual sympathy he felt for the homeless, but something far more striking: the man's face. The sleeping man, despite his unkempt beard and weathered features, looked remarkably like Marcus. They shared the same high cheekbones, the same broad nose, and even similar facial structure. The resemblance was so uncanny that Marcus found himself rooted to the spot, staring at what seemed like a mirror image of himself in different circumstances. While Marcus stood there, the homeless man stirred. His eyes opened slowly, revealing the same deep brown color as Marcus's own eyes. The man sat up, seemingly embarrassed to find someone watching him. He quickly gathered his things, his movements showing a dignity that surprised Marcus. "I'm sorry, I'll move along," the man said in a deep, educated voice that didn't match his appearance. He introduced himself as James Carter, and his articulate speech suggested he hadn't always lived on the streets. Marcus, usually confident and well-spoken, found himself struggling for words. "Please, don't go," he managed to say. "Would you join me for breakfast? There's a diner around the corner." James hesitated, pride visible in his stance despite his ragged clothes. "I don't need charity, sir," he replied firmly. "It's not charity," Marcus said quickly. I'd like to talk with you, if you're willing. My name is Marcus." Something in Marcus's tone must have convinced James, because after a moment's consideration, he nodded. Together, they walked to Sally's Diner, an old-fashioned establishment where Marcus sometimes enjoyed breakfast away from the expensive restaurants his peers frequented. The other customers stared as they entered, a well-dressed businessman and a homeless man making an odd pair. But Marcus's presence seemed to prevent any comments, and soon they were seated in a quiet booth at the back. Over steaming plates of eggs, bacon, and pancakes, James slowly began to open up. He was 43 years old, just 2 years younger than Marcus. He had once been a software engineer at a promising startup, but the 2008 financial crisis had hit him hard. His company collapsed, taking his savings with it. A series of personal tragedies followed: his wife's death from cancer, mounting medical bills, and eventually, the loss of his home. As James spoke, Marcus noticed more similarities between them. They shared the same gesture of running their hand through their hair when thinking, the same habit of tapping their fingers on the table while talking. It was more than just physical appearance. Their mannerisms were eerily alike. Marcus learned that despite his circumstances, James spent most of his days at the public library. He wasn't just seeking shelter. He was actually helping other homeless people learn basic computer skills, using the library's free computers. This revelation struck a chord with Marcus, reminding him of his own early days teaching coding to underprivileged kids before his big break in tech. As their breakfast meeting drew to a close, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than mere coincidence. He had always known he was adopted, and the questions about his biological family that he pushed aside for years suddenly came rushing back. Looking at James's face across the table, Marcus made a decision. He pulled out his business card, something he rarely did, and handed it to James. "I'd like to help," he said simply. "No strings attached. Just, let's talk again." James took the card, studied it for a moment, and his eyes widened as he recognized the name of one of the biggest tech companies in the country. He looked up at Marcus with new understanding, but before he could speak, Marcus had already paid the bill and was heading for the door, his mind racing with possibilities and questions about this strange encounter. Little did either man know that this breakfast would be the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. The next few days were a blur of activity for Marcus Wellington. He couldn't get James Carter out of his mind, and for the first time in years, his work took a backseat to his personal investigations. Sitting in his penthouse office, he found himself staring at his computer screen, diving deep into research about James's past. Marcus hired Tom Chen, his most trusted private investigator, to discreetly gather information about James. He wanted to help, but he also needed to understand the strange connection he felt. As a businessman who had built his empire on careful decisions, Marcus knew the importance of having all the facts. Meanwhile, James continued his daily routine, unaware of the billionaire's investigation. Every morning, he would pack up his few belongings from the shelter where he now stayed, thanks to Marcus's immediate arrangement, and head to the public library. The library had become his sanctuary, a place where he could maintain his dignity by helping others. Tom's first report arrived 3 days later. James's story checked out perfectly. He had indeed been a brilliant software engineer at a company called Tech Future Solutions. The investigator had found old newspaper articles praising James's innovative coding solutions. There were photos of him in a suit, speaking at tech conferences, looking every bit the successful professional he had once been. The report also revealed something that made Marcus's heart race. James had been born in Macon, Georgia, the same small town where Marcus's adoption had taken place. The coincidence seemed too perfect to ignore. One particularly rainy afternoon, Marcus decided to visit the library where James volunteered. Dressed down in jeans and a hoodie, he watched from behind a bookshelf as James patiently taught an elderly homeless woman how to create an email account. James's teaching style was gentle and encouraging, reminding Marcus of his own early days as a coding instructor. "You're doing great, Mrs. Johnson," James said warmly. "Now you can apply for jobs online and keep in touch with your grandchildren." The woman's face lit up with pride as she successfully sent her first email. Unable to contain his curiosity any longer, Marcus approached them. James looked up, surprised to see the billionaire in such a humble setting. "Mr. Wellington," he said, standing up respectfully. "Please, it's just Marcus," he replied, then turned to the elderly woman. "Would you mind if I borrowed James for a few minutes?" In a quiet corner of the library, Marcus shared what he had learned. As he spoke about Macon, Georgia, he noticed James's hands trembling slightly. "My father," James said slowly, "he was a traveling salesman named Richard Carter. He would be gone for months at a time. My mother always said he had another family somewhere, but we never knew for sure." Marcus felt his world shift. His adoption records had been sealed, but he had one piece of information about his birth father. He had been a traveling salesman. The timing, the location, their uncanny resemblance, it all started to make sense. "James," Marcus said carefully, "I was adopted from Macon in 1980. My birth father was also a traveling salesman." The two men stared at each other, the possibility of their connection hanging heavy in the air. The library's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they sat in stunned silence. Finally, James spoke. "I have an old photo of my father," he said, reaching for his worn backpack. He pulled out a carefully preserved envelope and removed a faded photograph. The man in the picture could have been either of them, aged 30 years. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He had seen the same face in his own adoption file, in the single photo he had of his birth father. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and showed James his digital copy of the same picture. They were looking at the same man. As the reality of their situation sank in, both men struggled to process their emotions. Marcus, the billionaire who had everything, and James, the homeless man who had lost it all, were more than just strangers who looked alike. They were brothers. The library was closing for the day, and as they walked out into the evening air, Marcus made a decision. "James," he said, "I know you don't want charity, but this isn't about charity anymore. This is about family. Let me help you get back on your feet. As a brother." James looked at the bustling city street, then back at Marcus. After a lifetime of pride and independence, accepting help wasn't easy. Something had changed. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, brother." Neither man could have predicted how this acceptance would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape both their lives and reveal even more shocking truths about their shared past. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to both brothers' lives. Marcus arranged for James to move into a comfortable apartment near his own penthouse, though convincing James to accept it took considerable effort. "It's temporary," James had insisted, "just until I get back on my feet." Marcus respected his brother's pride but couldn't help wanting to do more. One morning, while having breakfast together at Sally's Diner, which had become their regular meeting spot. Marcus noticed James scribbling complex coding algorithms on a napkin. He was helping one of his former library students develop a simple app for tracking job applications. "You haven't lost your touch," Marcus commented, studying the elegant solutions James had drafted. James shrugged modestly. "Programming is like riding a bike. Once you learn it, you never really forget." That's when Marcus had an idea. His company, Wellington Tech Solutions, had been planning to launch a community outreach program to teach coding skills to underprivileged communities. Who better to lead it than someone who had experienced both sides of the social divide? "I have a proposition for you," Marcus said carefully, knowing how James felt about handouts. "But I want you to hear me out completely before you respond." James set down his coffee cup and nodded, his expression guarded but curious. Marcus explained his vision: a comprehensive technology education program aimed at helping homeless and disadvantaged individuals rebuild their lives through digital skills. "And I want you to run it," he finished. "Not because you're my brother, but because you're the most qualified person I know for this role." Before James could protest, Marcus pulled out his laptop and showed him the statistics. The homeless population in Chicago had valuable skills and experience, but they lacked opportunities to use them. Many, like James, had professional backgrounds but had fallen on hard times. "Think about Mrs. Johnson from the library," Marcus continued. "Imagine hundreds of people like her, learning not just basic computer skills, but actual coding. Job-ready skills." For the first time since they'd met, James's eyes lit up with real excitement. He began adding to Marcus's idea, drawing from his own experiences on the streets. "We could partner with shelters," he suggested. "Set up computer labs, create a mentorship program." As they talked, their similar minds worked in sync, building upon each other's ideas. By the time they finished breakfast, they had outlined a comprehensive program that could genuinely change lives. However, their growing bond and successful collaboration was about to face its first serious test. That afternoon, as they were leaving the diner, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. A well-dressed woman stepped out, her expression grave. "Mr. Wellington," she said, addressing Marcus. "I'm Sarah Thompson from the Carter Family Trust. We've been looking for James Carter for quite some time." James froze. "The Carter Family Trust? I've never heard of it." Sarah explained that their father, Richard Carter, had established a trust fund before his death. It was meant to be divided between all his children, those he had publicly acknowledged and those he hadn't. The trust had been searching for potential heirs for years. "According to our records," Sarah continued, "James Carter is actually the primary beneficiary. As the only child born within Richard Carter's legal marriage, he is entitled to the larger share of the trust." Marcus felt a mix of emotions. He was happy for James, but a small part of him felt the sting of being the illegitimate son. However, looking at James's shocked face, he pushed aside his feelings. James seemed overwhelmed. "How much?" he started to ask. "The trust is currently valued at approximately $30 million, Sarah replied calmly. The brothers looked at each other, the implications of this news hanging between them. James, who had been homeless just weeks ago, was now a millionaire in his own right. More importantly, he was legally recognized as Richard Carter's primary heir. Marcus reached out and squeezed his brother's shoulder. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. But James's response would prove that money wasn't the most valuable thing he'd gained recently. Looking at Marcus, he said firmly, "This changes nothing between us. The program we planned, that's still what I want to do. Will you help me do it right?" Marcus smiled, feeling closer to his brother than ever. "Of course," he replied, "but something tells me this is just the beginning of our story." Neither brother knew then just how right Marcus was, or what other secrets their father's past still held. A month after the trust fund revelation, both brothers were working hard to launch their technology education program. They had converted an entire floor of the Wellington Tech Solutions building into a state-of-the-art training center. James, despite his newfound wealth, remained focused on their mission to help others. One rainy Tuesday morning, while reviewing applications for their first batch of students, James received an unexpected email. It was from a woman named Dorothy Williams, their father's former secretary at the company where he had worked as a traveling salesman. "I've been following your story in the news," Dorothy wrote. There's something you and your brother need to know about your father. I've kept this secret for 40 years, but now that you've found each other, you deserve the truth. James immediately called Marcus, who rushed over from his office upstairs. They sat together in James's newly furnished office, reading Dorothy's email. Your father, Richard Carter, wasn't just a traveling salesman, the email continued. He was running from something or someone. The last time I saw him, he was gathering documents about a technology patent he'd developed. He said it was worth millions, but someone was trying to steal it. Marcus and James exchanged shocked looks. Their father, a tech inventor? It explained their shared aptitude for technology, but raised countless new questions. Dorothy agreed to meet them at a quiet cafe across town. She arrived carrying a thick manila envelope, her gray hair neatly styled and her hands shaking slightly as she sat down. Richard was brilliant, she began, spreading old documents across the table. He developed a revolutionary data compression algorithm back in 1979. But before he could patent it, his business partner threatened to steal it. Richard knew no one would believe him over his wealthy partner, so he went into hiding. The documents showed complex technical drawings and calculations that looked surprisingly similar to some of the coding principles still used today. Both brothers could understand the sophistication of their father's work. He didn't abandon his families because he didn't care, Dorothy explained softly. He was trying to protect them. If his partner had found him, both families could have been in danger. James picked up a faded photograph showing their father in a laboratory, young and proud beside his inventions. What happened to the patent? He asked. Dorothy's expression darkened. His partner eventually filed it under his own name. He became a tech millionaire in the 80s. Your father? She paused. Your father died trying to prove the truth. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Which company? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Tech Future Solutions, Dorothy replied. The same company where James had worked before losing everything in 2008. The same company that had mysteriously collapsed despite its strong market position. That's not all, Dorothy continued, pulling out a final document. Richard left instructions. If anything happened to him, I was supposed to wait until his children found each other, then give them this. It was a detailed description of the original algorithm, along with proof of its development dates and Richard's signature. Legally, it was their inheritance, the true legacy of Richard Carter. Dad was protecting his invention all those years, James said quietly, and I ended up working for the company that stole it, never knowing the truth. Marcus was already pulling out his phone, calling his legal team. We can prove this, he said firmly. We have Dorothy's testimony, these documents, and with modern technology, we can show that Dad's original algorithm was the foundation for their entire business. James looked at his brother. You want to take them on? They stole from our father. They indirectly caused your downfall, Marcus replied. Yes, I want to take them on. But more importantly, I want to clear Dad's name. He deserves that much. Dorothy watched the brothers with tears in her eyes. Richard would be so proud of you both, she said. You're not just successful like he was, you're using your success to help others. That's what he always wanted to do with his invention. As they left the cafe, the brothers felt a new sense of purpose. Their technology education program had suddenly become more than just a charitable initiative. It was a way to fulfill their father's legacy of using technology to make a difference. But neither of them could have predicted how the battle for their father's stolen invention would lead them to the biggest shock of all. The legal battle over Richard Carter's stolen algorithm quickly became headline news. Tech billionaire brothers challenge industry giant, read the Chicago Tribune's front page. Marcus and James found themselves thrust into an even brighter spotlight than before. Wellington Tech's legal team worked tirelessly, examining Dorothy's documents and building their case. But it was James who made the breakthrough one sleepless night while reviewing old Tech Future Solutions code. Marcus. James called his brother at 3 a.m. You need to see this. Now. Within 30 minutes, Marcus arrived at James' apartment. James's living room was covered in printouts, his computer screen displaying lines of code. Look at this. James pointed to a section of code. This is from Tech Future's original software release in 1981. I used to work with this code every day, but look here. He pulled up another document, their father's original algorithm. Dad built in a signature, a pattern in the code that spells out his initials in binary. And it's still there, in every version of their software, even today. Marcus stared at the screen, amazed by their father's foresight. He knew someone might steal it, he said softly. He left proof for us to find. The next morning, they presented their discovery to their legal team. But before they could file the updated evidence, an unexpected visitor arrived at Wellington Tech's offices. An elderly man in an expensive suit walked into Marcus's office unannounced. It was Harold Peterson, the former CEO of Tech Future Solutions and the man who had stolen Richard Carter's work. "I suppose you think you've won," Harold said, lowering himself into a chair. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was firm. "But you don't know the whole story." James, who had been called to the office, stood in the doorway, his face hard with anger. "What whole story?" "How you stole our father's work and built your fortune on it." Harold pulled out an old envelope from his jacket. "Richard Carter wasn't just my business partner. He was my son-in-law." The revelation hit both brothers like a physical blow. Harold continued, "He was married to my daughter Catherine before he ever met either of your mothers. They had a child together, a daughter." Marcus sank into his chair. "We have a sister." "Had," Harold corrected, his voice breaking slightly. "Catherine and their daughter Emily died in a car accident in 1978. Richard was devastated. He threw himself into his work, developed the algorithm, but he wasn't thinking straight. He became paranoid, accused me of trying to steal his work." "But you did steal it," James interjected. "I protected it," Harold snapped. "Richard was going to sell it to our competitors. He said he needed money to start new lives with his real families. He was going to destroy everything we'd built. So yes, I took control of the patent. To preserve my daughter's legacy too." Marcus studied the old man carefully. "Why are you telling us this now?" Harold placed the envelope on Marcus's desk. "Because I'm dying. Cancer. And because that algorithm wasn't Richard's only creation." He nodded at the envelope. "Emily didn't die in that crash. Richard hid her to protect her from me. She's alive, and according to my investigators, she's been living in Seattle all these years." The brothers opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a recent photo of a woman in her mid-40s with their father's eyes and smile. "Her name is Sarah Thompson now," Harold said quietly. James and Marcus looked at each other in shock. Sarah Thompson, the same woman who had come to tell them about the trust fund. "She's been watching over us all along," James whispered. Harold stood up slowly. "The algorithm is yours. It was always meant to be. I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers." He walked to the door but paused. "Your father, despite everything, he was a good man. Better than me." After Harold left, the brothers sat in stunned silence. Finally, Marcus spoke. "We need to call Sarah." James nodded, still processing everything. "Our sister's been protecting Dad's legacy, making sure we found each other. And now we can all fulfill Dad's real dream," Marcus added, "using technology to help people as a family." But even as they reached for the phone to call their newfound sister, they didn't realize that the biggest test of their newfound family bond was still to come. Sarah Thompson arrived at Wellington Tech Solutions the next morning, her usual professional demeanor giving way to tears as she embraced her newfound brothers. The three siblings sat in Marcus's office, decades of hidden truths finally coming to light. "I've known about both of you for years," Sarah explained, wiping her eyes. "Dad made me promise to watch over you from a distance. He said timing was everything. You had to find each other naturally, or the truth would never come out about Harold and the algorithm." James leaned forward. "But why didn't you tell us right away when we found each other?" Sarah pulled out an old journal from her briefcase. "Because of this. Dad's journal. He wrote down everything. His research, his life, his regrets. But most importantly, his plan." She opened the worn pages, showing complex notes and personal entries. He knew Harold would never let go of the algorithm while he was in control. The company had to fail first. Marcus's eyes widened. "Tech Future's collapse in 2008, that wasn't just bad luck?" Sarah shook her head. "I had been working behind the scenes for years, carefully exposing the company's vulnerabilities. The financial crisis just provided perfect cover." She looked apologetically at James. "I never meant for you to lose everything in the process. That wasn't part of the plan." James sat back, stunned. His entire life's collapse had been partially engineered by his own sister. But before he could respond, their meeting was interrupted by an urgent knock. Dorothy burst in, looking frightened. Harold Peterson just called a press conference. He's going to reveal everything about Richard Carter and the algorithm. The siblings rushed to the conference room, where the local news was broadcasting live. Harold stood at a podium, looking frail but determined. Today, I confess to stealing a revolutionary technology from its rightful creator, Richard Carter, Harold began. But what the world doesn't know is that Richard Carter was more than just an inventor. He discovered something dangerous, a flaw in the algorithm that could be exploited to access any computer system in the world. The siblings looked at each other in alarm. Sarah quickly flipped through their father's journal. "He's right," she whispered. "Dad found a universal backdoor. That's why he wanted to keep it secret." On screen, Harold continued. "I'm making this public now because this technology is about to fall into the hands of Richard's children. They run the risk of making the same mistakes their father almost made. This algorithm should be destroyed before it can be misused." The press erupted with questions, but Harold collapsed at the podium. Within minutes, news broke that he had been rushed to the hospital. Back in Marcus's office, the siblings faced their first real crisis as a family. "Dad's journal has the solution," Sarah said, pointing to a complex series of calculations. "He created a way to fix the security flaw, but it would require completely rewriting the core code." Marcus paced the room. "We could do it. Between the three of us, we have the skills." "But should we?" James asked quietly. "Maybe Harold's right. Maybe some things are too dangerous to risk." Sarah stood up, her expression determined. "Dad didn't want us to destroy it. He wanted us to fix it, together. That's why he made sure we'd all find each other. Look." She showed them the journal's final entry. "My children, if you're reading this, you finally found each other. The algorithm was never about making money or changing technology. It was about bringing you together. The flaw in the code can only be fixed by combining your different perspectives. Marcus's innovation, James' practical experience, and Sarah's protective insight. Together, you can make it what it was always meant to be, a tool for helping people." The siblings looked at each other, a new understanding passing between them. Their father had orchestrated everything, their separation, their reunion, even their different life paths, to prepare them for this moment. "We're going to need help," Marcus said finally. "Our students from the education program, they could be part of this. Make it a true community effort." James nodded slowly. "Turn Dad's legacy into something bigger than just us." Sarah smiled, closing the journal. That's exactly what he would have wanted. But as they began planning their next steps, none of them noticed the small red light blinking on Marcus's office phone, signaling a message that would throw their careful plans into chaos. The message light on Marcus's phone continued blinking as the siblings worked late into the night, planning how to fix their father's algorithm. Finally, around midnight, Marcus noticed it. "Hold on," he said, pressing the playback button. The room filled with Harold Peterson's weak voice, recorded just before his collapse at the press conference. "There's something else you need to know," Harold's voice rasped. "Your father didn't just create one algorithm. He created two. The second one. It's much more powerful. Richard called it the Guardian. I never managed to steal it from him, but someone else did. Check the basement of his old house in Macon. The proof is there." The siblings exchanged worried glances. "The house is still there," Sarah confirmed. "I've kept track of it all these years. It's abandoned now." Within hours, they were on a private jet to Georgia. As they flew, James discovered something disturbing on his laptop. "Look at this," he said, showing them a news article. 3 major tech companies have been completely shut down by an unknown cyber attack. The pattern? It looks like Dad's coding style. The old Carter house stood dark and deteriorating on the outskirts of Macon. Using flashlights, the siblings made their way to the basement. Years of dust covered everything, but Sarah went straight to a loose brick in the wall. "Dad showed me this hiding place when I was little," she explained, pulling out a rusted metal box. Inside, they found a stack of yellowed papers and a small hard drive. Marcus carefully connected the drive to a secure laptop. What they found shocked them all. The Guardian wasn't just an algorithm. It was an artificial intelligence program, decades ahead of its time. "This is impossible," Marcus whispered, scanning the code. This technology shouldn't have existed back then. Look at the date stamps, James pointed. Dad was updating this until the day he disappeared. He never stopped working on it. Sarah found a letter in the box addressed to them. Reading it aloud, her voice trembled. My dear children, if you're reading this, then the Guardian has awakened. I designed it to activate only if all three of you came together. It's meant to protect the world from technological threats, but in the wrong hands, it could do terrible damage. The recent cyber attacks are likely someone trying to replicate my work. Only you three, working together, can stop it. The key is in your DNA, literally. I encoded the fail-safe to respond only to my children's combined genetic markers. James looked at his phone. More companies were being hit by the cyber attacks. The global internet was starting to show signs of strain. We need to get back to Chicago, Marcus said urgently. Our students from the education program, they could help us analyze this. But when they arrived at Wellington Tech Solutions, they found chaos. Their own systems were under attack. The building was in darkness, backup generators barely keeping essential systems running. Their students, however, hadn't given up. Led by Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman James had taught email to in the library, they had set up a makeshift command center in the training room. We've been tracking the attacks, Mrs. Johnson said, surprising them with her newfound tech expertise. They're coming from somewhere in Chicago. Using their combined skills, Marcus's resources, James' practical coding experience, and Sarah's strategic thinking, they began fighting back. Their father's notes showed them how to use the Guardian to protect rather than attack. Working through the night, they traced the attacks to an unexpected source, an abandoned Tech Future Solutions facility. Security cameras showed a familiar face, Harold Peterson's son, Robert, obsessed with claiming what he saw as his birthright. He must have found Dad's early notes, Sarah realized. He's trying to recreate the Guardian, but he doesn't have the fail-safe. That's why everything's going wrong. The siblings looked at each other, understanding their father's final lesson. The algorithm, the Guardian, the education program. None of these things were meant to work in isolation. Just like them, the technology needed balance, cooperation, and human connection to work properly. As dawn broke over Chicago, they prepared to confront Robert Peterson. But first, they had to make a decision that would affect not just their family legacy, but the future of technology itself. The choice they would make would lead to the most shocking revelation of all. In the early morning light, Marcus, James, and Sarah stood before the abandoned Tech Future Solutions building. Their students from the education program had helped them create a secure network, isolating Robert Peterson's attacks from the rest of the internet. Remember what Dad wrote, Sarah said, clutching their father's journal. The Guardian isn't just about protection, it's about redemption. Inside the building, they found Robert Peterson surrounded by humming servers, his eyes wild with desperation. You don't understand, he shouted when he saw them. This should have been mine. My father built Tech Future, and your father destroyed it. No, Robert, James said calmly. Your father stole from ours, but that's not even the real story. Marcus stepped forward, holding up the DNA results they discovered in their father's files. Robert, you're our brother too. The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. What? Sarah opened the journal to its final pages. Dad knew. Your mother worked at Tech Future. She and Dad. They had a relationship before he met any of our mothers. Harold raised you as his own, never telling you the truth. Robert sank into his chair, a fight training from him. That's why Dad always pushed me so hard to understand the algorithm. He was trying to keep me connected to my real father's work. The siblings approached their newfound brother. On the screens around them, the Guardian's code pulsed, waiting for their combined DNA to activate its true purpose. Dad designed the Guardian to need all of us, Marcus explained. Not just our DNA, but our choices. It won't work through force or theft. It needs cooperation. James touched one of the servers. That's why the education program was so important. Technology isn't meant to be hoarded or controlled. It's meant to lift people up, give them opportunities. Together, the four siblings entered their genetic markers into the Guardian's interface. The system hummed to life, but not as a weapon or a tool of control. Instead, it began healing the damage done by the attacks, while simultaneously creating a new kind of network, one that could help protect and educate people around the world. Mrs. Johnson and the other students from their program were the first to benefit. The Guardian's technology, combined with their father's original algorithm, created an adaptive learning system that could teach anyone, anywhere, regardless of their background or resources. Robert, his anger replaced by understanding, looked at his newfound siblings. "I spent years trying to prove myself worthy of the Peterson name," he said quietly. "I never knew I was a Carter all along." In the following weeks, the siblings worked together to transform both Wellington Tech Solutions and what remained of Tech Future. They created the Carter Foundation, dedicated to providing technology education to underprivileged communities worldwide. The Guardian, now working as intended, helped protect this network of learning and opportunity. Harold Peterson, watching from his hospital bed, finally found peace. Before he passed away, he transferred all rights to his company's assets to the Carter Foundation, completing the circle of redemption their father had envisioned. The most shocking part of their story wasn't just the discovery of another sibling or the power of the Guardian. It was how their father, Richard Carter, had looked decades into the future and seen that technology's greatest purpose wasn't profit or power. It was bringing people together and lifting them up. 1 year later, the siblings stood together at the opening of the first Carter Technology Education Center. James, once homeless, now led their global education initiative. Marcus had transformed his company into a force for positive change. Sarah managed their foundation's protective networks, and Robert used his skills to help others recover from technological disasters. Mrs. Johnson, now a coding instructor herself, cut the ribbon at the ceremony. Richard Carter's greatest invention wasn't an algorithm, she told the crowd. It was the love he put into his work, knowing that someday it would bring his children together to help others. The four Carter siblings smiled at each other, understanding at last that their father's true legacy wasn't in the code they'd inherited, but in the lessons they'd learned about family, redemption, and using their gifts to make the world better. And somewhere, they knew, Richard Carter was watching, proud that his children had finally discovered what he had known all along, that the most powerful algorithm of all was love.